Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Prepare to discover the chilling story of Isabel Báthory, the bloody Countess. Oh, you dare to know the horrors committed by this woman in medieval Europe? Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. We are going to talk about Isabel Báthory, a 16th century Hungarian countess, wrapped in a black legend that has made her the most bloodthirsty figure in history. His name whispers terror even today, and although the truth is mixed with exaggeration, the magnitude of its history is undeniable. Imagine a woman of the nobility, with immense power and a life full of luxuries, which is wrapped in accusations of horrible crimes. What led this woman to commit such atrocities? That is the question we are going to try to answer. The stories about the bloody Countess are chilling. It is said that he tortured and murdered hundreds of young peasants, bathing in his blood to maintain his youth. These terrible accusations, although possibly exaggerated in their number, paint a picture of unprecedented cruelty and perversion. Remember that the information that was disseminated at the time was influenced by the political and social tensions of the time, and that is something that we must take into account. The legend of Countess Báthory transcended the borders of Hungary, becoming a myth that has inspired countless works of art, books, and movies. Its history, a mixture of reality and fantasy, invites us to reflect on the power, cruelty, and fascination exerted by the dark figures of history. What really is in all this? We are going to unravel the legend, separating the myth of reality, little by little. Imagine, for a moment, the opulence and power of the Báthory family. They were not noble. His lineage went back centuries, intertwining with Hungarian royalty and the Polish nobility. Báthory's generations had accumulated land, influence, and, of course, enemies. His political power extended as a web, weaving alliances and rivalries in the complex European court of the 16th century. They were a family accustomed to wealth, luxury, and exercise of power without limits. His ancestry told you a story of strategic marriages, of alliances that ensured their position and extended their influence. Imposing castles and vast properties testified their wealth and status. But remember that, together with wealth, rivalry, and struggle for power also came in the intricate political networks of the time. The Báthory moved with skill, but also with dangerous consequences. A slip, a poorly calculated alliance, could trigger a war. Báthory's political connections were crucial to understand their power and fall. They were part of an elite that controlled the fate of Hungary and its neighboring regions. His marriages and alliances were not only love issues, but tools to maintain and expand their influence. This power fabric, as complex as dangerous, was the scenario where Isabel Báthory starred in her macabre story. Remember, her family legacy marked her deeply. So imagine little Isabel Báthory, surrounded by luxury and maids. He grew in imposing castles, with vast land and a life that most could only dream. His education, however, was not just that of a noble lady. He received instruction in languages, music, and the arts of his class, but also in politics and strategy, preparing it for a world where power was disputed with nails and teeth. But that privileged life was not exempt from shadows. The Hungarian court was a hotbed of intrigues, political alliances, and rivalries. Since childhood, Isabel witnessed the cruelty and ambition of the powerful, an environment that undoubtedly shaped her character in the shadow of the castles and the secrets of the nobility. Despite his refined education, Isabel's life was not free from the limitations imposed on the women of the time. His future was preordered, a strategic marriage to consolidate the power of his family. This destiny, however, was intertwined with the stories of horror and cruelty that would make it a legend. How would this pre-established future affect the young Isabel? That is a question that only time and its actions would answer. But that luxury life soon changed. At 11. They married you with Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a man much older than you, a powerful tycoon and an experienced military commander. Imagine the ceremony, the weight of the dresses, the sound of the trumpets. An arranged marriage, a political union rather than a fairy tale romance. He, tanned in 1,000 battles, was quite the opposite of the young and spoiled Isabel. Prosody / speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The influence of Count Nadasdy was decisive in Isabel's formation, her rigid character and her pragmatic mentality. Forged in the battlefields, deeply contrasted with the refined education she had received. He taught him, perhaps without intention, the hardness of power the importance of the strategy and the little consideration given to human life in the circles of the nobility. The frequent absences of the Count in military campaigns left Isabel with considerable power, but also with great loneliness. Her aristocratic education and her husband's absence created a void that, over time, would be filled in a terrible way. The influence of the Count, although at a distance, was fundamental in the creation of the monster in which it would become. So, imagine life in Cashite, an imposing castle, located in a lonely hill, surrounded by an aggregate and mysterious landscape. Its stone, high and gray walls seemed to challenge the passage of time, mute witnesses of centuries of history. From its windows, you could observe an extensive panorama, with endless fields and a vast sky, sometimes threatening, sometimes serene. The castle was a microcosm of power, an opulent shelter and, at the same time, a place of isolation, away from the bustle of the court and the outside world. Within its walls, opulence was overwhelming. Sumptuous rooms, decorated with rich upholstery, dark and heavy wooden furniture, and glass candlesticks that reflected the candlelight, creating an atmosphere at the same time luxurious and grim. Painting adorned the walls, counting stories of battles, romances, and power. You, in the midst of all this luxury, were in the center of a world of privileges and also of deep loneliness. But that opulence hid a deep isolation. Countess was far from everything, a remote and almost inaccessible place. The castle, with its thick walls and its few windows, felt like a fortress, a golden prison. Life there passed at a slow pace, marked by the rhythms of nature and the imposing silence of the place. You could walk through the gardens, if you dare to do it, but the immensity of the landscape and the loneliness of the place made it a space that could feel both majestic and threatening. But what really happened in Cashite? Rumors began to circulate subtly, like the icy wind that whipped the castle windows. They talked about a growing obsession of Isabel for her beauty, a sickly obsession that consumed her. It was said that her youth faded, and that she, desperate to stop the relentless passage of time, resorted to methods unusual. Initially, these were only talk, whispers among the peasants who worked the surrounding lands. But the stories began to gain strength, to grow in every detail. Fed by fear and uncertainty, it was said that the Countess performed strange rituals, which was locked in her rooms for hours, and that she came out with even more pronounced paleness. Isabel's obsession with eternal youth was not an open secret, but the way she sought to achieve it was. The first suspicions pointed to a desperate search for a magical potion, an elixir that would return its youthful beauty. But the growing paleness of the young women who entered at the service of the Countess and never came out again, began to feed the rumors of something much more sinister. Imagine Cashite Castle, an imposing but cold place. There, among its walls, the life of the maids began to change. First there were small punishments, blows to some carelessness, but Isabel's fury intensified. Remember that these women, young and vulnerable, barely had where to go. They were peasants' servants. Their lives, in the eyes of the nobility, were worth little. The subsequent testimonies, collected after the arrest of Isabel, speak of increasingly deep wounds, false marks, burns with red iron, small details that, as a whole, painted a chilling painting of systematic abuse that no one dared to denounce the Countess. His power protected her from any type of retaliation. Fear was an invisible wall that imprisoned his victims. Think about the despair of these women, isolated and without hope. His screams of assistance were lost in the immensity of the castle, silenced by the power and impunity of his tyranny. The first crimes, although they still did not reach the brutality that would be known later, were already a sample of the monstrous capacity of Isabel to inflict pain and suffering. Terror was installed in the bowels of the castle, an omen of what was to come. But those punishments were only prelude. Remember that I was talking about a change. The young women began to disappear, one after another. Rumors, initially whispered in the kitchens and corridors of the castle, became more insistent. They talked about needles, of burns with iron alive, bites, of a sadism that went beyond simple cruelty. Prosody. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. It is said that Isabel used needles to prick her victims, causing unbearable pain. Other sources speak of bites, how she herself, with her own hands, inflicted deep injuries. Imagine the scene. The cold metal of a needle, the pressure of the teeth, the blood. All this in the dreary atmosphere of the castle. Burns with red iron were, according to testimonies, a usual practice, the sissio of metal on contact with the skin, the smell of burnt meat. A dantesque show that developed between the walls of the castle, far from the indiscreet looks. Think about the terror of those young people, in the agony they had to suffer. But what led Isabel to commit such atrocities? The answer is found in the beliefs of the time. Imagine a world where life and death were mysteries, where medicine was rudimentary and superstition abounded. In that context, blood was considered something magical, an elixir of youth, a source of vitality. It was believed that young, pure blood could revitalize the elderly, returning the freshness and vitality lost over time. This belief, although today it seems absurd, was rooted in the society of the time. Think of vampire legends, the fascination with blood as a symbol of life. For Isabel, obsessed with beauty and rejuvenation, this belief became a twisted justification for its crimes. She, convinced that young women could maintain her youth, did not hesitate to resort to extreme violence to obtain what she wanted. It was not simply a murder, but a macabre ritual, an attempt desperate to challenge nature itself. Think of the young Alona Jo, one of Isabel's maids. You could imagine it, perhaps, as an scared girl, forced to participate in horrors for fear of the fury of the Countess. His silence, his obedience, became a forced complicity, a survival at the expense of lost innocence. What do you think if we consider that your main motivation was terror, the instinct of preservation before a constant and overwhelming threat? Now think of Duracientes, the person in charge of the administration of the fortress. His role was crucial. She, with her privileged position, was responsible for recruiting the victims, managing the constant flow of young people who disappeared in the Cashite castle. Do you think his motivation was greed, the desire to obviously obtain favors and keep his position at the expense of the lives of other women? Perhaps he sought to ascend on the social scale, in a world where loyalty to the Countess meant wealth and power. Finally, there is Katerina Banica, another of the maids. She, unlike Alona, seems to have enjoyed a certain power. It is believed that he actively participated in the torture of the victims, and some historians suggest that their motivation could have been a mixture of fear, obedience, and a strange type of fascination with violence. Can you imagine the complexity of your motivations? What role did blind loyalty play, social pressure, or even a possible perversion in their actions? But Alona was not alone. You wonder what happened to the Hungarian nobility. Why did they allow these atrocities to continue? The answer is complex, and is based on an accomplice network, fed by fear, convenience, and complicity. Isabel Báthory was a powerful woman, belonging to one of the most influential families in the kingdom. Attempt against her meant confronting considerable force, capable of triggering devastating consequences. Many nobles, even those who suspected Isabel's activities, preferred to remain silent. It was easier to look the other way than to challenge such a powerful and well-connected figure. In addition, the network of relations between the nobility was intricate, and an accusation against Isabel could involve others in the scandal, putting at risk their own positions and privileges. Silence became a survival strategy. The omission of justice was not simply a matter of indifference. It was a conscious choice, a tacit pact between the nobility to protect their own interests. Isabel's research and trial, when they finally occurred, were a long and complicated process, full of political intrigues and social pressures. The truth about the magnitude of his crimes took us to emerge, and many of the culprits were never exposed. But silence broke. A rumor, first whispered among the peasants, reached the ears of King Matthias II. They talked about torture, murders, an unimaginable horror perpetrated in Cashite Castle. An investigation was ordered, an incursion into the strength of the Countess, a place until then impenetrable, untouchable, thanks to the complicity of the nobility. Imagine the scene. The arrival of the royal soldiers, the tension in the air, the expectant silence before the storm. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. What they found inside was much worse than they could have imagined. Bodies, dozens of them, young peasants, dead in frightful ways. The walls were stained with blood, heavy air with the smell of death and rot. You will wonder how so many deaths could go unnoticed for so long. The answer is found in the power, influence, and corruption that surrounded Countess Báthory. The investigation was exhaustive, although biased by the social position of the accused. Servient guards were questioned, even some nobles who had visited the castle. His testimonies, although sometimes contradictory or incomplete out of fear, painted a terrifying picture of life inside those walls. Torture instruments were found, irrefutable evidence that corroborated the atrocities committed. The evidence was overwhelming, although the subsequent judicial process was far from perfect. Imagine the despair of their families, humbled peasants, impoverished nobles, all united by the same tragedy. The disappearance of their daughters, sisters, or even wives, his faces, before full of life, now only reflected the anguish of uncertainty. The rumors reached their ears, whispered under the protection of the night, stories of a gloomy castle and a cruel countess. Subsequent investigations revealed chilling testimonies. Young girls, barely teenagers, kidnapped and taken to Cashite Castle. Testimonies of servants who managed to escape, describing horror scenes that even blood will frost you today. They talked about torture, brands in the bodies, a slow and agonizing death. You will wonder what happened to their families. Pain, impotence, the desperate search for answers. Many never found the body of their loved ones, condemned to live with the uncertainty and weight of an irreparable loss. Others found only remains, dispossession of what were once people full of dreams and hopes. And so, we arrive at the trial. Imagine the scene. A cold, wet room, full of murmurs and accusing looks. You, as a spectator, are in the midst of chaos, observing how this judicial process against Isabel Báthory develops. Justice or revenge? The line is blurred among contradictory testimonies, political pressures and exaggerated accusations. The victims, or rather, their families, cry out for justice, but will the system be given? Many of the witnesses were servants, pressured or even tortured to declare against the Countess. His testimonies, forced and full of inconsistencies, became the basis of the accusation. Remember that, at that time, torture was a common practice to obtain confessions, which makes questionable the veracity of the statements filed before the court. How to know what was true and what was a falsehood manufactured under pressure? The Hungarian nobility also had its own reasons to want to see Isabel Báthory fall. His power and influence represented a threat, and his judgment served, in part, to consolidate the position of other nobles. Think about political pressure and hidden interests that were hidden after the apparent search for justice. Was it an impartial trial or a farce orchestrated by powerful enemies? The verdict fell like a slab. Life imprisonment in Cashite. You imagine the scene, right? She, the Countess, has owned a vast territory, now confined to a few cold and humid rooms, surrounded by stone walls that would be her grave in life. The trial, with all his accusations and testimonies, vanished, leaving only the echo of the sentence, an echo that would resonate for centuries. The walls of the castle, mute witnesses of their crimes, would now also witness their agony. His cell, small and dark, was barely furnished. A rough straw bed, a worn wooden table and a jug of water. The silence, broken only by the constant drip of water and the wind whispering through the cracks of the stone, was its constant company. A deep and terrifying loneliness. It is said that they left her in a sealed room, with only a small opening to receive food and water. Darkness, penetrating cold and loneliness became its cruelest torturers. Imagine despair, repentance, the fear that consumed it on those walls. There, in that stone prison, the legend of the bloody Countess began to transform himself into something darker, more mysterious. 5 years. 5 years locked in those cold stones. Far from luxury and the power that I so longed for. I imagine that his days were consumed slowly, between the darkness and the silence of his prison. You wonder how its end was. The chronicles speak of a silent, almost imperceptible death, as if the same life had abandoned it without struggle. Some say he died of a stroke that left her motionless and breathless. Others, who succumbed to a disease, perhaps aggravated by the harsh conditions of his captivity. The truth, like so many things in his life, was lost in the mystery. Prosody? Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. What we do know is that Countess Isabel Báthory died in her cell, in 1614. Her death marked the end of an era of terror, but not the end of the mystery that surrounds her. Its history is still alive, feeding legends and feeding our fascination by the dark side of human nature. But how many are there in the legend of the Bloody Countess? You ask yourself, right? The story that comes to us is dyed of exaggerations and rumors, fed by the morbidity and the need for a memorable villain. The accusations of mass murder, blood baths with virgins, all that, although shocking, needs a critical analysis. There is talk of 650 victims, a figure that many historians question, based on the lack of forceful evidence. The documents of the time, the testimonies, many were obtained under torture, a common practice at that time that, as you can imagine, could easily lead to false confessions. Even the accusations themselves seem to be full of contradictions and exaggerations, the result of fear, superstition, and revenge of those who sought to get rid of a powerful noble. The reality is probably much more gloomy, but also more human. Maybe Isabel Báthory was a cruel woman, yes, capable of violent acts. But the magnitude of its crimes, as we have been told for centuries, is wrapped in a layer of mystery and legend, hindering the separation between historical truth and popular exaggeration. Remember that the story is written by the victors, and in this case, the victors had a lot of interest in creating a monster. But Báthory's story doesn't end there. His legend has transcended centuries, becoming an icon of popular culture and the cinema. We have seen her interpreted in various ways, sometimes like a ruthless villain, others as a tragic figure, victim of the political intrigues of her time. Have you wondered how these representations have influenced the perception we have of it? Literature has also explored its figure, from Gothic novels that present it as a supernatural creature to biographies that try to unravel the truth behind the myth. Each author has shaped her in her image and likeness, reflecting the obsessions and fears of her own era. Think of how the figure of the Countess has evolved over time, adapting to the sensibilities of each generation. And in art, Báthory has inspired countless painters and sculptors. From realistic representations to more abstract interpretations, its image has been reinterpreted again and again, feeding the mystery that surrounds it. What do you think of the image that is projected from it in these different artistic manifestations? How do these works contribute to perpetuating their legend? But what is behind the legend? Many believe that the story of the Bloody Countess was exaggerated, even manufactured. Some theories point to a political conspiracy. Think about this. Isabel Báthory was a powerful woman, belonging to one of the most influential families of Hungary. His enemies could have used accusations of cruelty as an excuse to dismantle their power and appropriate their lands and fortune. Perhaps the truth is much more complex than it seems. Imagine the rivalry between noble families, the struggles for power, the palatial intrigues. The accusation of murder could have been a political tool to eliminate an uncomfortable figure. Remember that research was directed by people with their own interests, perhaps interested in taking advantage of the situation for their own benefit. Can you imagine the stir that caused in court? The trial, of course, was a show, but was it fair? Another theory suggests that Báthory was a victim of the superstition of the time. It was believed that young blood could maintain youth and beauty. Perhaps his actions, although horrible, were the result of a belief deeply rooted in the society of the moment. It is not about justifying it, but about understanding the context in which the events occurred. Could the belief in hidden practices have influenced accusations and judgment? But Báthory's story did not stay in the past. His legend has remained alive, feeding films, books, and plays for centuries. Think of how his name has become synonymous with female cruelty, an archetype that has transcended time and that even today is chilling. Why do you think your story continues to fascinate us? His image, that of a ruthless nobleman who tortured and murdered hundreds of young people, has become an icon of popular culture. It has been used as a metaphor for corrupt power, misogyny, and perversion of privilege. Have you ever thought about how your story has been represented in different artistic works? What message do you think they try to convey? /prosody /speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The legacy of the Bloody Countess is complex. While some see her as a victim of a conspiracy, others consider her a ruthless serial killer. Regardless of historical truth, its legend has deeply influenced popular culture, shaping our perception of evil and female power. How do you think its history has influenced your own world vision? But how much are there in those terrible stories? You ask yourself if torture and murder stories are real or an exaggeration fed by the black legend that surrounds the Countess. The key is to analyze historical sources with great care. The testimonies collected during the trial, for example, come from servants and peasants, people who could have had reasons to lie or exaggerate to take revenge or get favors. Many modern historians have questioned the reliability of these statements, pointing out the pressure to which these people were subjected. Remember that the Inquisition was a reality, and the accusations of heresy or witchcraft were common. It is possible that the confessions have been obtained through torture, or that they simply adapt to what was expected of them to save themselves. On the other hand, physical evidence is scarce. While some bodies with suspicious wounds were found, there is no irrefutable proof that directly connects to Báthory with all the crimes attributed to it. The lack of forceful evidence has led many to believe that the magnitude of their crimes was exaggerated, perhaps to justify their condemnation and looting of their properties. Returning to Isabel Báthory, how do you compare with other serial killers in history? It is easy to fall into the trap of exaggerating its crimes, fed by the black legend that surrounds it. But, if we analyze the numbers coldly, is it really the bloodiest? Many serial murderers throughout history have far exceeded their number of victims, although with different methods. Think of Jack the Ripper, whose victims were never found in their entirety, or in the crimes of Gilles de Rais, a noble partner, with a history of atrocities equally frightening. The key difference lies in propaganda and historical context. The trial against Báthory was a political event, an attempt to silence a threat to the Hungarian nobility. The exaggeration of her crimes served the interests of those who accused her. On the other hand, other murderers, often of lower social classes, went unnoticed or their crimes were minimized by the authorities. Was Báthory exceptionally cruel? Definitely. But was the more blood? That is a question that requires a much deeper and more nuanced analysis, considering the sources and the historical context of each case. Comparing it with other serial murderers such as Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer is interesting but also misleading. His methods and motivations were different, his completely different historical contexts. Báthory acted in a feudal world with a legal and social system very different from ours, or that of the time of Bundy and Dahmer. Understanding its history requires going beyond numbers and entering the analysis of the social, political, and religious context of the 16th century in Hungary. Only then can we approach a more complete understanding of their crimes and its place in history. But what prompted Isabel Báthory? Analyzing your mind is complicated, since historical sources are dyed of exaggerations and propaganda. However, some theories point to a possible psychopathy. Imagine a woman with a deep lack of empathy, unable to understand the suffering of others, and with an insatiable need for control and power. Perhaps his privileged education, isolated from the real world, contributed to its psychological development. Think of in childhood where their whims were laws, where violence and cruelty had no consequences. That lack of limits, combined with possible emotional instability, could have taken it along a dark path. Another theory focuses on the possible influence of its surroundings. The society of the time was brutal, with great social inequality. For her, peasants could have been seen as lower beings without the right to life or respect. That mentality, combined with its power and wealth, could have led her to believe over the law. It is important to remember that we cannot diagnose someone who lived centuries ago. But, studying his life and the actions attributed to him, we can speculate on the possible factors that contributed to his behavior. And although we will never know with certainty what was going through his mind, analyzing his story helps us understand the complexity of evil. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Imagine the 15th century Hungary. A fragmented kingdom, constantly threatened by Ottoman invasions. The nobility, to which Báthory belonged, enjoyed an almost absolute power over their lands and peasants. They were times of wars, palatial intrigues, and a deep social inequality. For you, understanding this context is key to understanding Isabel's actions. The political power was concentrated in the figure of the king, but the influence of the great noble families, such as Báthory's, was immense. They could control entire territories, administer justice almost autonomously, and, in practice, act with impunity. This feudal system, with its abuses and inequalities, was the perfect breeding ground for violence and arbitrariness. Think of everyday life. The majority of the population was peasant, subject to forced labor and with few opportunities. Justice was hard and arbitrary, and life was precarious. In this environment of oppression and lack of rights, Isabel's actions, however horrible, must be understood within the context of the time, although that does not justify them. Think about the time. Magic was real for many people. It was not a game, but a powerful force that could influence life and death. For Isabel, belief in black magic was something everyday, not a fantasy. It was said that he believed in the power of young blood to maintain his youth and beauty, a terrifying idea that was perfectly framed in the superstitions of the time. Legends talk about strange rituals, blood baths of young peasants, all with the aim of conserving their beauty. For her, they were not crimes, but magical practices necessary to maintain her eternal youth. This thought, rooted in the popular beliefs of the time, justified it in his own mind, although not in the eyes of the law. But to what extent was he really believer or simply used superstition as an excuse for his actions? Some historians believe that magic was a justification for their actions, a way of evading the responsibility of their crimes. Regardless of his true belief, the superstition of the time played a fundamental role in the context of his atrocities. Imagine the 17th century Hungary. For you, a woman of the time, life was a constant struggle for survival. Your role was defined by your social position, usually subordinated to that of men. If you were noble, your destiny was linked to marriage, a strategic agreement rather than a union of love, with the aim of ensuring the power and wealth of your family. You would depend completely on your husband, with hardly any rights or your own voice. If you were peasant, the situation was even more precarious. Your day-to-day focused on hard work in the field, without rest, under the yoke of poverty and lack of opportunities. Your life was marked by the endless cycle of agricultural work, with few possibilities of education or social ascent. Motherhood was a constant, with a high infant mortality that supposed a recurring tragedy. In any social stratum, education for women was limited, restricted to domestic tasks and marriage preparation. Your access to knowledge and culture was minimal, which left you in a position of vulnerability to manipulation and oppression. Superstitions and popular beliefs, so entrenched in society, had a great impact on your daily life, shaping your fears and expectations. Think of the judicial system of the time. A labyrinth of privileges and corruption. Justice, if it can be called that, depended largely on the social position of the accused. If you were noble, you had many more possibilities to get unpunished, even in the face of serious accusations. The power of the nobility extended to the same court, directly influencing the result of the trials. For a lower-class woman, justice was a chimera, a mirage in a desert of inequality. The tests were often subjective, based on unreliable testimonies or torture to obtain confessions. Torture, a common practice, was not a method to seek the truth, but a way of obtaining a confession, regardless of its truthfulness. Imagine the terror of being submitted to that process, without the possibility of a fair defense or an impartial judgment. The lack of procedural guarantees left people vulnerable to manipulation and injustice. The bureaucracy was slow and inefficient. The judicial processes continued for years, leaving the victims and their families in a situation of helplessness. Corruption was endemic. Bribes and the influence of the powerful distorted the course of justice. In such a defective system, the possibilities of obtaining justice for women, especially those of lower class, were practically null. It was a system designed to perpetuate inequality and impunity. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Imagine for a moment the story they have told about Isabel Báthory. Bloodbaths, hundreds of victims, an insatiable thirst for cruelty. But what is true in all that? The truth is that the legend of the Bloody Countess has grown and has been distorted over time, fed by the rumors and exaggerations of an era where the information was scarce and the superstition flourished. Many of the crimes attributed to Báthory were never strongly proven. Testimonies, obtained under torture and pressure, are highly questionable. Remember the context: a corrupt and partial judicial system, where the nobility enjoyed impunity. The accusation against her could have been a political maneuver to get rid of a powerful and independent woman. The number of victims, estimated in hundreds, is probably an exaggeration. Modern research suggests a much lower, although tragic, figure. And the bloodbath method, although they are mentioned in the documents of the time, there are reasonable doubts about their truthfulness and extension. Let's not forget that propaganda and black legend played a crucial role in the construction of their image. Think about the terror that had to reign in the region. Rumors about the crimes of the Countess extended like gunpowder, feeding the paranoia in each village and castle. People lived with constant fear, whispering terrifying stories in a low voice, with their eyes constantly alert, fearing that the next victim could be anyone, even themselves. The nobility, accustomed to a certain order and security, was shaken to its foundations. The trust among people disappeared, replaced by a deep distrust that poisoned all relationships. The fear atmosphere became a double-edged sword. The suspicion fell on anyone who stood out, to have a privileged position or simply wake up envy. The accusations were easily launched, fed by collective panic and the lack of solid evidence. Justice, already fragile at that time, was overwhelmed by a flood of complaints and contradictions, many of them unfounded but generated by the climate of terror reigning. Uncertainty seized everyone, generating a state of anxiety and generalized distrust. The social impact was devastating. The economy of the region resented due to the insecurity and paralysis of daily activities. Social relations broke, trust disappeared, and community collaboration became impossible. The society was fragmented, as each person focused on their own survival, to protect themselves from the possible danger that his neighbor, his friend, even a member of his own family. Terror had become the dominant element, transforming social life into a scenario of fear and perpetual distrust. Imagine, for a moment, such these walls speaking. What secrets keep your stones about the horrors committed inside? Many documents were destroyed, others manipulated, and the truth about the scope of Báthory crimes has been lost in the labyrinth of time. The investigations of the time were impartial or influenced by the politics and rivalries of the Hungarian nobility. You wonder, how many victims were there really? Official figures are chilling, but do they represent the complete truth or just a fraction of atrocity? There is talk of dozens, even hundreds of missing young people. How many stories were left unconsciated? How many families shattered by the cruelty of the Countess, without anyone knowing the truth ever? The mystery persists around the participation of their accomplices. Were they mere instruments in their hands, or were they as involved in barbarism like her? To what extent did your crimes arrive? Was there a complicity network that protected the Countess for years, allowing the killing to continue unpunished? But you will wonder, why has Báthory become such a powerful symbol? Its history, wrapped in mystery and exaggerations, projects it as the incarnation of female evil. The patriarchal society of the time needed an atoning goat, a figure that embodied the worst fears about women. Uncontrolled power, unleashed sexuality, cruelty without limits. Báthory, with his wealth and apparent impunity, became the perfect canvas to project these anxieties. Extreme cruelty is attributed to him, but how much of that is true and how much is the product of a propaganda carefully orchestrated by powerful men who feared their influence and wealth? Báthory's image, the Bloody Countess, was built and perpetuated to serve a political and social purpose that it served to reaffirm the established order and keep women in their place. Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Think about it. What would happen if a man of his position and with his wealth would have committed similar acts? Would it be remembered in the same way? The answer is probably a resounding. Báthory's symbolism lies in the investment of gender roles, in subversion, even fictitious or exaggerated, of the social order. She became the female monster par excellence, a reflection of the deep fears of a society that needed to control female power. But his legend transcended the story. Have you wondered how such a dark figure has managed to perpetuate itself in popular culture? The answer is found in literature. Authors from different eras have found in the figure of Báthory a fascinating muse, an inexhaustible source of inspiration to explore issues such as power, cruelty, and feminine nature in a complex historical context. From Gothic novels to modern stories, its name resonates as an echo of the past, distorted and amplified by fantasy. Think about the number of novels, poems, and plays that have taken it as the protagonist. Analyzing these works, we see how the Báthory figure transforms and adapts to each literary context. Sometimes, it is represented as a ruthless monster, a pure being evil. On other occasions, it is humanized, exploring the possible causes of its actions, presenting a more complex and nuanced perspective. What do each author look for reinterpreting their history? The literary analysis of these works allows us to understand how Báthory's figure has evolved over time, reflecting the concerns and prejudices of each era. It is a fascinating process that speaks to us not only of the Countess itself, but also of the society that created and judged it. What aspects of Báthory's history resonate more in contemporary literature, and which have been forgotten? But literature is not the only place where the Bloody Countess has found immortality. The cinema, with its ability to visualize the unimaginable, has embraced its history, offering us different interpretations of its life and crimes. From faithful adaptations to historical stories to freer and fantasy versions, the figure of Báthory has captivated directors and screenwriters for decades. Have you wondered how they have approached their character on the big screen? Some films focus on ruthless cruelty, showing explicit scenes, although always within the limits of censorship of their time, of their alleged acts. Others, on the other hand, enter their psychology, seeking to understand the motivations behind their behavior. You will find versions that present it as a victim of patriarchy, trapped in a system that forced her to act that way. What perspective is more convincing to you? The cinematographic analysis of these adaptations reveals a constant fascination for the ambiguity of his character. It is not simply a one-dimensional villain. The complexity of its history, with its lights and shadows, allows filmmakers to explore different issues, from the nature of power to moral corruption, through gender violence and the construction of female identity in a historical context as complex as that of early modern Europe. Each film offers a new perspective, a new reading of the legend. But the fascination with Báthory transcends the screen. Art, in its multiple forms, has portrayed its legend, offering interpretations that range from the direct representation of its figure to more subtle metaphors of its cruelty. Note how artists have captured their essence, sometimes as an imposing and seductive figure, others like a ruthless monster. The ambiguity of his image, so typical of the legend, is reflected in the diversity of his artistic representations. Think about the details. How is your face represented? What emotions transmits your gaze? What symbolizes your clothing? The choice of color, the texture of the fabrics, even the position of their hands, everything contributes to building a visual narrative. Some artists show it as a powerful, almost real figure, while others present it as a monstrous being, reflecting the duality inherent in its history. The analysis of these works is not limited to the simple description. You can also interpret the message that each artist wanted to transmit. What aspects of their history are emphasized? What emotion seeks to evoke the work? Analyzing the composition, the color palette, and the symbols present, you can understand how art helps perpetuate, and at the same time, reinterpret the legend of the Bloody Countess. But its impact goes far beyond paintings and sculptures. Think about cinema, for example. Báthory has inspired countless films, books, and video games, becoming an icon of terror and fascination with the dark. His story, although possibly exaggerated, has fed the popular imagination for centuries, feeding the narrative of the cursed, powerful, and ruthless woman. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. His name has become synonymous with cruelty, but also of a certain perverse fascination. Why does your legend continue to captivate us so much? Perhaps it is the mixture of horror and mystery, the shadow of historical truth hidden under a layer of black legend that attracts you. It is the story of a woman who challenged the rules of her time, even through brutality. In literature, music, and even in the theater, the Bloody Countess has found her space. It has been reinterpreted, transformed, and reinvented again and again, adapting to the sensibilities of each era. His figure has transcended the limits of history to become an archetype, a symbol of what we fear and, at the same time, which intrigues us. But what does all this mean today? Báthory is not just a historical character. It has become an archetype, a symbol of female cruelty that, curiously, fascinates and repels in equal parts. Its history, although dark and terrible, continues to captivate us, feeding our thirst for horror and mystery stories. His name resonates in popular culture, an echo of the centuries that reminds us of the complexity and darkness of the past. Think of horror movies, gothic novels, video games. The image of the Bloody Countess, with her black robes and her penetrating gaze, appears again and again, reinventing itself over the years. She is a dark muse, a figure that embodies our worst fears and, at the same time, our fascination with the forbidden. His legend persists because he touches universal issues: power, corruption, justice, revenge. It is a story that adapts to each era, which is constantly reinterpreted through different lenses. And it is precisely this ability to adapt that keeps it alive today, making it a cultural phenomenon that transcends time. So what do you fit after knowing the story of the Bloody Countess? Perhaps a sense of restlessness, a mixture of fascination and horror. It is easy to fall into the trap to judge it from our modern perspective, but we must remember the historical context. His life, although brutal, tells us about a different era, of a society with norms and beliefs that today are strange and even scary. Báthory's legend, built through the centuries, has far exceeded historical reality. It is a warning about power, manipulation, and human cruelty, but also about how stories are transformed and magnified over time. How many are in the accusations? How much is the product of propaganda and exaggeration? That is a question that is still open to debate. In the end, the story of Elizabeth Báthory invites us to reflect on human nature, about our capacity for good and evil. It reminds us that the past, although distant, continues to speak to us, whispering lessons about power, justice, and fragility of truth. And you, what do you think? What has left you the story of the Bloody Countess? Surely you wonder, was it really as cruel as they paint it? The truth is complex. Historical sources are mostly stories of Báthory's enemies, written with the aim of discrediting it. Many historians discuss the veracity of the most extreme accusations, although no one denies that their behavior was, at least, strange and questionable. How many victims did it really have? Here uncertainty is even greater. The figures that are considered, ranging from tens to hundreds, are based on unreliable testimonies and exaggerations. There is no precise and objective record of the real number of victims, and probably there will never be. And the famous bloodbath, is it true? Although the legend is popular, there is little historical evidence that confirms it. It is believed to be an exaggeration of accusations, a way to increase the horror associated with their crimes. Reality, as usually happens, is much darker and less spectacular. Finally, why is the most bloodthirsty woman considered in history? This is a matter of interpretation. While his crimes were horrible, comparing it directly with other historical leaders and figures responsible for large-scale massacres requires careful consideration of the context and the available evidence. His fame is partly due to the fascination and morbidity that awakens his figure. And we arrive at the end of this chapter about the Bloody Countess. Before saying goodbye, I want to thank you for accompanying me on this trip through the story of Isabel Báthory. Your interest is what makes these videos possible. I also want to express my gratitude to all researchers and historians whose works have been fundamental for the creation of this video. His meticulous research and critical analysis have been the basis of everything you have seen. And of course, I cannot forget the people who collaborated in the edition, music, and special effects. His talent has been essential to give life to this story and make it more attractive to you. Thank you all. /prosody, /speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Remember that you can find all the sources consulted in the video description. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I wait for you in the next one. But our story does not end here. What do you think about Isabel Báthory's legacy? Do you think its history is an exaggeration, a black legend, or a terrible reality? I would love to read your opinions in the comments. Share your thoughts, your doubts, your own investigations. Any contribution is welcome, and if you have passionate the figure of the Bloody Countess, I encourage you to investigate on your own. There are many sources, some contradictory, other fascinating ones. Look for information in books, academic articles, documentaries. Discover the truth for yourself. In addition, share this video with your friends and family. Perhaps they are also interested in knowing the history of this enigmatic historical figure. Help me spread knowledge and generate an interesting debate around the figure of Isabel Báthory. I await your comments. I hope you found the story of the Bloody Countess. If you liked it, give like and subscribe for more dark stories. What do you think about your legacy? Leave it in the comments. /prosody, /speak.